July 16, 1945, 5:29 a.m. In the New Mexico desert, a flash brighter than the sun vaporizes sand into glass and splits the atom for the first time in human history. Standing 20 miles away, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who built this weapon, watches the mushroom cloud rise and whispers words from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." But 1,500 miles away in Potsdam, Germany, President Harry Truman receives a coded message: "Baby satisfactorily born." He doesn't think about Hindu philosophy or the nature of destruction. He thinks about politics. Soviet Russia grabbing territory, American boys dying in a planned invasion of Japan, and his own credibility as a leader who inherited the world's most terrible decision. In 3 weeks, that decision will kill 200,000 Japanese civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But here's what makes this story so haunting. The bomb wasn't really dropped on Japan. It was dropped on the Soviet Union as a political message written in atomic fire. This is the story of how humanity's greatest scientific achievement became its most morally complex political weapon, and why understanding this decision might be the key to preventing nuclear war in our own dangerous age. When Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, Vice President Harry Truman had been kept completely in the dark about the Manhattan Project. This failed haberdasher from Missouri, thrust into the presidency, learned about humanity's most powerful weapon from his Secretary of War like it was a budget briefing. "Mr. President," Henry Stimson said, "we have developed a bomb of extraordinary power. It could end the war in weeks, but it will change warfare forever." Truman's political instincts immediately grasped the implications. This wasn't just a military weapon, it was the ultimate political card. Whoever controlled atomic weapons would dominate the post-war world. And Stalin's Soviet Union was already grabbing everything it could reach. The political pressure on Truman was immense. Americans wanted their boys home from the Pacific. Congress was demanding results from the $2 billion Manhattan Project, the most expensive secret program in American history. Military leaders were planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, which could cost 1 million American casualties. But the real political calculation was about the Soviet Union. At Yalta, Roosevelt had practically begged Stalin to enter the war against Japan. Now Stalin's armies were steamrolling through Manchuria, positioning themselves to occupy half of Japan just as they'd occupied half of Europe. Truman faced a political nightmare. If Japan surrendered to Soviet forces instead of American ones, Stalin would control the Pacific just as he controlled Eastern Europe. The atomic bomb offered a way to end the war before Soviet influence spread further. James Burns, Truman's Secretary of State, put it bluntly: "The bomb might well put us in a position to dictate our own terms at the end of the war." This wasn't about military necessity. It was about political dominance in the atomic age. While politicians calculated advantages, the scientists who built the bomb were wrestling with unprecedented moral questions. Many had fled Hitler's Europe, believing they were racing to prevent Nazi Germany from getting atomic weapons first. But Germany had surrendered in May 1945, and now their creation was aimed at Japan. Leo Szilard, the physicist who had first convinced Einstein to write to Roosevelt about atomic weapons, organized a petition. The atomic bomb should not be used against Japan without a clear warning and an opportunity to surrender. 69 scientists signed it, but the petition was buried by military censors. The Manhattan Project's secrecy meant that the very people who understood the weapon's true horror had no voice in how it would be used. J. Robert Oppenheimer found himself caught between science and politics. He had recruited many of the world's best physicists with appeals to stop Hitler. Now Truman's advisors were asking him to estimate how many atomic bombs it would take to force Japanese surrender. The moral complexity was staggering. These scientists had created a weapon that could end the war instantly, potentially saving millions of lives. But using it would make America the first and only nation to use atomic weapons against civilian populations. Oppenheimer later described his position. "We didn't know beans about the military situation in Japan. We didn't know whether they could be caused to surrender by other means, or whether the invasion was really inevitable. But we also knew that if the bomb worked, it would save American lives." The political system had made the ultimate moral decision a technical question, not whether to use the bomb, but how to use it most effectively. The Target Committee's meetings revealed the true nature of the atomic decision. Military targets like Japanese naval bases or troop concentrations were rejected. Instead, they chose cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki, based on their psychological impact. Secretary of War Stimson personally removed Kyoto from the target list. As he told Truman, "I had visited Kyoto before the war and knew it to be a historical city that the Japanese particularly revered." But his real concern was political. Destroying Japan's ancient capital might make post-war reconciliation impossible. Hiroshima was chosen as the primary target not because it was militarily crucial, but because it had been undamaged by conventional bombing. The atomic bomb's effects would be clearly visible and psychologically devastating, a political message as much as a military strike. General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, was explicit about the political purpose. The target should be a vital war plant, employing a large number of workers and closely surrounded by workers' houses. The goal was maximum civilian casualties to demonstrate American power. But the most revealing political calculation was timing. Military advisors told Truman that Japan was already defeated, cut off from resources and considering surrender. The Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded that Japan would have surrendered by November 1, 1945, even without atomic bombs or invasion. So why drop the bombs in August? Because Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan by August 15th. If Soviet armies conquered Japan's mainland forces, Stalin would demand a role in occupying Japan. The atomic bombs were a race against Soviet political influence, not Japanese military resistance. Truman's diary entry from July 17th revealed his thinking. "Finny Japs, when that comes about." He wasn't talking about ending Japanese resistance. He was talking about ending the war before Stalin could grab more territory. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. The explosion killed 80,000 people instantly and reduced the city center to ash. 3 days later, Fat Man destroyed Nagasaki, killing another 40,000. Japan announced surrender on August 15th, just hours before Stalin's deadline for entering the Pacific War. The political timing was perfect. America alone would occupy and reshape Japan, but the moral cost was unprecedented. For the first time in human history, atomic weapons had been used against civilian populations. The nuclear age had begun, not with military necessity, but with political calculation. Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech was brutally honest. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. Japan surrendered not to American military might, but to the fear of atomic annihilation. Truman's public justification focused on saving American lives in a planned invasion. But privately, his political success was obvious. The Soviet Union was excluded from the Pacific. America emerged as the sole atomic superpower, and Truman's credibility as a decisive leader was established. The human cost of that political victory would haunt the world forever. Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't just military targets. They were political demonstrations written in human ash, warning Stalin and the world about the price of opposing American interests in the atomic age. The atomic bombings created a moral paradox that still haunts us today. They ended World War II, potentially saving millions of lives in a prolonged conflict. But they also established the precedent that civilian populations are legitimate targets in political warfare. Oppenheimer spent the rest of his life wrestling with his creation's legacy. When asked if he had regrets, he said simply, "I made one mistake in my life when I signed a letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made, but there was some justification, the danger that the Germans would make them." But the deeper moral question isn't about individual guilt. It's about how democratic societies make decisions about ultimate weapons. The atomic bomb was developed in secret, decided in private, and used without public debate. The most consequential decision in human history was made by a handful of politicians and generals. This pattern continues today. Nuclear weapons policy is still decided by small circles of political and military elites, with minimal public input or democratic oversight. We live in a world where the survival of civilization depends on political decisions made in secret by leaders who may prioritize political advantage over human survival. When I think about Truman's decision, what terrifies me isn't just the moral complexity. It's how easily political calculations can override human considerations, even when the stakes are literally civilization itself. Today, 9 nations control over 13,000 nuclear weapons, each many times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The decision-making process remains essentially unchanged. Small groups of political leaders with the power to end human civilization. We live in an era where political tensions between nuclear powers, America and Russia, India and Pakistan, potentially Iran and Israel, could escalate to atomic warfare based on the same kinds of political calculations Truman made in 1945. Social media and 24-hour news cycles have made political decision-making even more reactive, more driven by immediate political pressures rather than long-term human consequences. Leaders face instant global scrutiny, making thoughtful deliberation about nuclear policy nearly impossible. The lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki isn't that Truman was evil. It's that the political system that makes such decisions is fundamentally broken. As long as nuclear weapons exist in a world of competing political interests, the risk of atomic warfare remains not a technical problem, but a political inevitability. The question for our generation is whether humanity can develop political institutions wise enough to control the weapons we've created, or whether political pride and fear will ultimately write our civilization's final chapter in atomic fire. In our next episode, we'll explore how the atomic bombings shaped the Cold War's political psychology, creating a world where nuclear weapons became the ultimate political currency. This has been the Story Arc, where we connect the past to the present. I'm your host, and I'll see you next time.